everyone, Joe Killinger with ERD. Thank you for tuning in today. We've got a great video lined up for today. We've asked George Pino of Commercial Brokers International to come in and speak to us. Actually, he's a CEO of Commercial Brokers International. And we're going to discuss deposits for single family, multifamily, and commercial real estate. How to handle them, when you have to give them back to the tenants once they move out, and lots of other exciting stuff. So stay tuned. So with apartments, what on a unit, what's the amount of deposit that you get?
Well, you know, it's interesting that deposits are actually a somewhat negotiable item, and a lot of times the landlord will put the deposit in place based upon the credit worthiness and or the rental history of the actual tenant. So typically speaking, assuming somebody has a good credit and rental history, they look for about 1 month of a security deposit. Now, what you need to be aware of, though, is that different municipalities have different rules and regulations on the maximum amount of security deposit that you can charge. For instance, in California, you can charge up to 2 months of a security deposit, 2 months of the rent as a security deposit, 3 months if it is a furnished apartment. So we rarely see that unless the person has really bad credit, and in some cases many landlords are even taking a half month's of security deposit as half months of rent as a security deposit, as if the tenant has amazing history and great credit.
Okay, very good. As you were talking about deposit, it got me thinking about the whole skip problem that we're seeing across the country. That a skip is somebody that moves in on a move-in special. Let's say, just for rough numbers, they have a move-in special of $100 moves you in. This individual will live in that unit for 30, 40 days typically, and then they move to a building right next door or down the street that's running the same special. So they go from place to place to place every month, and they never pay a full month's rent. So that's something you've got to watch out for. So really make sure that I'm going to do a little pitch here for the RD and the incident reporting database. That system was built to track that. So it's very important. It's a free service that the RD offers, so you might want to check that out. But be careful with the skips. Returning deposits. I guess you can probably touch on California, correct?
Absolutely.
In California, how long do you have to return the deposits? And how much do you return typically?
Well, by statute, you have 21 days from the time that the tenant turns over the property back to you to get to them a statement of to return the entire security deposit or the remaining security deposit plus any statement and bills that were actually paid for damages that they may have caused. Now, what you can deduct, and this is something to be aware of, is that the security deposit, it's not meant to be the last month's rent or anything else. So a tenant could be held liable for more than the actual security deposit if there's additional damages that were done, or if they used that and didn't pay the last month's rent and thought that they could do it that way. They need to be aware that if you're going to do that you can still legally be held liable for additional damages and or more of the security deposit. At the same time, the landlord, if he does not, or if they do not within 21 days put in writing and send something out to the tenant that the security deposit for the is being withheld due to these reasons, plus add the bills into it, they are legally obligated to return 100% of the security deposit. So that's what they need to be aware of on the timing issues. Most landlords are pretty aware of it. They do get that in and out pretty quickly.
And now, is that just California, the 21 days, or is that
Yes,
nationwide?
that's
okay.
California.
So how can they find out what that is in any other given state?
What I would do is go into, there's generally speaking, most states have a tenant and landlord website that will go into all the details of that, and you can definitely take a look at that. Just Google it, and you can find all the requirements when it comes to security deposits for that.
Okay. Is the pet deposit the same thing? Is it the 21 days, or that's just part of the deposit, right?
Well, interesting question that you ask, actually. What I mean by interesting, what I mean by interesting is that a lot of times People actually do a separate pet deposit.
Okay.
However, I wouldn't necessarily recommend that. Two reasons. Number one is you still...
Wait, you wouldn't recommend a pet deposit or separating?
A separate pet
Okay.
deposit. I would
Alright.
recommend instead increasing the deposit to cover for the pet.
Okay.
What I would, and the main reason for this is twofold. One is by statute, you're still limited to the amounts of security deposit that you can charge, the 2 months or 3 months if it's fully furnished.
Okay.
Whether you call it a pet deposit, security deposit, or however you call it. The next thing to take into consideration when it comes to a deposit is that if you say it's a pet deposit, you can only deduct then damages caused by that pet. So you can't just automatically assume that the damages are caused by the pet. You have to show that it was due to the pet or additional wear and tear. You also, for instance, can't automatically deduct cleaning fees when it comes time to return the security deposit unless you actually had to clean. If the tenant returns the property in the same condition that it was delivered to them, subject to normal wear and tear, then you can't have really any deductions.
Okay. Is there a set amount for a pet deposit? Or is it just what you feel you can charge?
No real set amount for a pet deposit, actually. You can, as long as the total deposit falls within the guidelines of the 2 months, 3 months rules.
Okay. All right, that makes sense. Now let's move on to commercial real estate. I've got a retail space that I'm thinking about leasing out. What kind of deposit could I get from a retailer?
Well,
Or office, or
office or anything. Commercial real estate's
across.
actually quite interesting in that it doesn't have as many regulations. It's a lot more landlord friendly.
Okay.
Also, commercial spaces tend to take longer to lease, so if someone breaks the lease or has to move out or the business fails, the landlord could be held, have a lot more damages. Because of that, if the company is a proven company with a proven track record and history, you can typically get away with 1 month of security deposit, usually equal to the last month's rent. However, new companies, new startups, they can pay 6 months, sometimes a year worth of security deposit, year worth of rent in security deposits. There's also different ways that landlords may take into consideration, meaning a blend of actual security deposit with letters of credit from banks and institutions if they were to default on the lease.
Personal guarantees.
Personal guarantees as well. That's something to really be to take into consideration as well, because the personal guarantee can run the entire length of that lease if it takes that long to lease up the space. One thing that you do have to remember as a landlord is just because you may have a personal guarantee on a property, it doesn't mean that you don't have to try and relet the property and mitigate your damages. You, by law, have the obligation to try and mitigate your damages. That doesn't mean that you have to lease it or wait for someone to lease at the same price or higher, but you have to try and lease out the space again, and if they were to break the lease early, and if you lease it out at a lower rate, then sure, the person that had the personal guarantee is responsible for the difference, but you've mitigated your damages. Also, what's interesting is we talked about a little bit on the residential side, the timeframes for the statutes for returning of security deposits. That's not necessarily the case in commercial real estate. Generally speaking, it is written in terms of the lease. The lease itself will dictate when they have to return it, because commercial tends to be a little bit more moving and a little bit more detailed as far as moving parts. It can be up to 30 days, sometimes even longer, but typically about 30 days.
Okay. Another topic that we should probably touch on is with the deposits is how much interest do you owe the people that you're giving the deposit back to?
Okay. Again, this is actually something that's typically on the residential side regulated by statute. And in California, you don't actually owe any interest until unless they've lived there for over a year, and then the interest that's payable, that is due, is based upon an amount that and actually different municipalities set for rent control in Los Angeles. Commercial, you typically don't owe any interest. That's written down, that saying that this is, you're not paying any
It's
interest on it.
negotiated ahead of time.
And that's negotiated ahead of time, so.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you very much, George. That was very
Absolutely.
informative.